So now, recall or recollect with me the fact that there are different ahruf, right? If we're going to understand it the way of Ibn Jazari's interpretation, that means pronunciation will differ according to some ahruf, and the written form will also differ in accordance to some ahruf. And also we talked about abrogation and some verses that were abrogated in their recitation only, or recitation and ruling. And some of these abrogated verses were not abrogated till the last year, and sometimes even in the last review. And those later abrogated verses, those verses were still being recited after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, not by people in Medina, but by those companions who had memorized it previously and traveled far away. So it was just a fact that those verses were still out there. And we talked about how difficult it would be to contain a verse that's being taught from person to person once it's out there. So these abrogated verses caused an issue later on. Another aspect of transmitting the Quran orally and written that may not be mentioned readily in books is people make mistakes. So if one person teaches 10 and misses a letter, or mispronounces a word, or brings a word forward or backwards, or adds a letter or adds a word, then you have 10 students, all of them memorizing that mispronunciation or incorrectness. And then those 10 students, each one of them has 10 students, and in a blink of an eye, within months, you'll have hundreds of Muslims who have memorized an ayah incorrectly out of good intention. The teacher did not intend to make a mistake, but we're humans. And all of these issues were now happening, okay? And when today, if you memorize something incorrectly, the way to discover it's incorrect is by many ways. I think the easiest one is open the Quran and read it. But remember, the Quran wasn't fully collected except in one single place. It was right now at the time in the house of Hafsa. All other written forms of the Quran were either scattered or did not have an authentic chain of narration fully to the Prophet ﷺ. So there wasn't a written reference. One, that's huge. That's a huge issue. Two, when you transmit the Quran orally, it's required that it's transmitted identically by people from various backgrounds to eliminate that mistake of the one person. The one person who makes a mistake and teaches 10, and then those 10 teach 10 more, and then those 10 more teach 10 more, you have 1,000 before you know it. When there's a requirement of tawatur on each level, that eliminates that one mistake by that one person, because you have so many other hundreds and thousands who say, no, you're wrong. Okay, so at the time of Othman radiallahu anhu, he was now the Khalifa, Islam had spread beyond the Arabian borders. Okay, now it's going up to Turkey. It's going beyond Turkey, Armenia and Azerbaijan, that's beyond the Turkish Caucasus. Huh? It went west towards Egypt and Northern Africa. It went towards Iran and the Persian areas. So people from regions were embracing Islam, and not all of them were Arab. And if you're not Arab, it'll be hard for you to learn the Quran. So you'll be learning the Quran verbatim and not necessarily maybe grasping the meaning of each word. So now the Arabic language has a huge role in what's going on in transmitting the Quran and keeping it in its original correct form that was reviewed by the Prophet ﷺ in the final review with Jibreel alayhi salam. Okay, but everyone was trying their best. I'm not sure, Brother Ali, do you have your hand up for a question? I apologize. Or is it for another reason? I just want to make sure that you don't have a question, inshallah. Okay. So now there's the Battle of Yamama. Battle of, not Battle of Yamama, a battle in Armenia. I don't think it has a name. It was just, he was attending certain battles in the areas of Armenia, and also it said Azerbaijan. Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, a companion, radiallahu anhu, he was there and he witnessed firsthand the ramifications of all these possible problems that I mentioned. He saw Muslims who were reading different verses differently from each other and were fighting until they almost held up arms against each other, and بدأوا يكفر بعضهم بعضا. They started calling each other with kafir names. Again, so now this argument may contain one or many of all these possibilities we mentioned before. Could they be quarreling about correct ahruf, just like Umar radiallahu anhu was dragging Hisham bin Hakim? Or could they be quarreling about a mistake? One of the teachers taught them and they're comparing the recitation to someone else and they're noticing a difference. So they're quarreling about a mistake, actually. Or could they be quarreling about an abrogated ayah that was taught by some of them and not by the others? So they're calling each other names, really bad names. It could be any, an all, or a combination of all the above. The problem was they were fighting. That's the problem. That's the terrifying thing. It wasn't like they were sitting calmly and trying to find an educated answer and seeking a solution. No, they were fighting. So they were quarreling amongst each other over differences in the ways they were reciting. Okay. The differences that he heard were a mixture of correct ahruf, along with mistakes occurred from individuals, which it's, yes, it does happen, and as well as abrogated verses. So this is the possibility of the different reasons why Muslims would start really, you know, calling each other kafir. And it shouldn't be, but you know, it was that big of an impact. Okay, so in such faraway regions, there was no reference text. So some companions might have a surah or two with them. Some might have a different surah or two. Some might not have any written form, and some will have maybe a lot of the Quran written with them. But either way, there was no Mushaf in these regions or anywhere other than the house of Hafsa radiallahu anhu that was 100% authentically linked to those scriptures written in front of the Prophet ﷺ. So there was a huge possibility of those written texts to have mistakes in them, because when you copy from a copy, it's different than when it's the original copy, or you make a copy with the agreement of Sahaba and being reviewed by a committee. And definitely different from when you write from memory, because if you've memorized wrong, then you'll write it wrong, and you'll write it from your own ijtihad and not how it was written in front of the Prophet ﷺ with the approval of al-Wahi. So there was no reference text. So imagine you're trying to review Surah Al-Baqarah and there's absolutely no written Quran anywhere around you, and you're reviewing it. So Brother Wadi', you're reviewing Surah Al-Baqarah with Brother Ali, and you disagree about an ayah. Is it Wallahu Sami'un Alim or Wallahu Alimun Hakim, for example? And there's no Quran anywhere. What do you do? What do you do? It's a problem. That's what they were facing. It's a huge issue. It's kind of terrifying. I imagine that you can't remember an ayah and you can't find it written anywhere. What sorrow would you feel in your heart? It's total bewilderment, such sadness. So there was no written text. So the only reference they had was each other's memories. So they would then go ask their teachers if their teachers were still available and in town, right? Otherwise, they quarreled, they disagreed. So there was no reference text. By that, I mean a written, authentic mushaf. A mushaf that whatever's in it is correct. It did not exist, that they could refer to. So the quarreling became more serious and more widespread. It was increasing. So Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman knows this is a huge issue. Related to the story of the sorrow a Muslim would feel if they've memorized a Quran or even a surah and there's no way for them to check if they're correct. There's a, I don't know whether to say it's sad or amazing or happy. I would say it's a very mixed feeling story. But for myself, it's more towards the sad. Of course, I expect every one of us knows the story of how our brothers and sisters, African Americans, where they came from. They were kidnapped and enslaved from different regions in Africa. And a lot of those regions were Muslims. A lot of our brothers and sisters who were enslaved as Muslims, and then that deen was either forcefully beaten away from them or over time washed away. May Allah forgive them and us. One story is about Ayyub or Ayyubi bin Muhammad, I believe. He was actually a Qur'anic and Islamic scholar who was kidnapped and enslaved and brought to the United States of America. And he was a Hafiz al-Qur'an. And when you're enslaved and kidnapped, nothing comes with you, maybe not even your clothes. And he was enslaved. Eventually, his masters realized that he was more valuable as an educated, person. So they started allowing him to have writing tools. So he wrote his own Mushaf from whatever memory he could remember. Imagine, you're in America, enslaved. There's no Muslims around that you know of, definitely no other Hafiz, and you're terrified of forgetting the Quran, and you're finally given, years later, a method of writing it down, so you write the Quran to the best of your ability. Eventually, the story ends nicely where he was freed and he actually returned, to my knowledge, he returned to Africa, or maybe he was at least freed. And there's a picture of him wearing the Quran that he wrote from memory. He would wear it around his neck like a necklace. I think I also put this in the group last year, so remind me to look it up. It's a heart-wrenching but amazing story. The story, I first learned about it through the Smithsonian Museums here in the Washington, D.C. area. It was given by a scholar in North African Muslim scholarship. So source-wise, it's authentic. The article I found isn't a Smithsonian article, but the information is what I heard from the scholar. So may Allah give rahmah to our brother Ayyubi and reward him so much. I can't imagine the anguish and everything he had to go through to preserve the Quran and have to write it eventually from memory and carry it around his neck. He loved it so much, subhanAllah. Okay, so this is, the feeling of every Muslim where you're afraid you've memorized an ayah and you don't have something written. So it's a huge problem. Your name is Ayyubi. I think his name is Ayyubi or Ayyub, something like that. And mashallah, Sister Rayyan is now posting the link to buy that. It's sold out. Okay, I can contact Nibras and ask them for more, inshallah. But usually they'll say, how many more do you want? Because these masahif tend to be expensive. Like I think they're sometimes 70, sometimes 100, depending on how many they buy in the season. So maybe in the group, if someone wants to do it, we can, see interest and give them an average number of maybe how many brothers and sisters are interested. Okay, so back to the Musahif Uthmaniyya. Let me see if it's time to stop for prayer. I think this is a good place since we talked about Brother Ayyubi, rahmatullah alayhi, and related to the story of not having a reference text. We'll stop for Salat al-Maghrib here in the Washington, D.C. metro area. We'll stop for 15 minutes. So it's 8:49. Let's make that 8:50. We'll come back at 9:05, inshallah, and continue our story with Hudayfa radiallahu anhu, conveying this terrifying piece of information of the Muslims fighting over all these differences and try to see how that was solved, inshallah ta'ala. Continue the story of Uthman radiallahu anhu. Jazakumullahu khairan, and I'll see you in 15 minutes, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.